Aitzwael, Amietz Pawhuilam. Good day, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to our second session for this Learning Circle series taking place in December 2025. Today's topic of conversation is responding to denialism in professional settings. And the calling that I've had for this very specific conversation is the climate and context we find ourselves in Canada today. So I would be remiss if I hosted this webinar and did not share with the group here who is live in the audience um, that this was largely in response to some very powerful political leaders who were denying and really creating a hateful, dismissive, violent um, rhetoric and really trying to create a movement for denying 215 and beyond children who are being found in unmarked graves in residential schools all across this country, denying that these atrocities had happened. And I didn't really want to create a webinar to address that. I wanted to create a webinar and a space to be with like-minded, like-hearted individuals, Indigenous relatives and colleagues of mine across Turtle Island, but also to create space for our survivors to show that we're here and we're doing this good work. We are championing this good work. Indigenous colleagues, Indigenous professionals, leaders, and allies doing this good work, that we're coming together and we're responding. We are responding to the resistance that we are seeing. And I really look at it as colonial resistance. Um, it's worth noting that um, Brody, who has been really, I see Dallas Brody's content being shared widely on social media channels on my Indigenous platforms that I follow on Instagram and Facebook. And it's worth noting that she has been removed from party leader, which is a start, but that does not come at the cost of the people she has amassed behind her. And I think that's worth noting. That's worth navigating and talking about in our professional workplaces. There is a strange relationship between political institutions and the culture and values that trickle down into our government workplaces, our corporate workplaces. And it's easy to get a sense of that if you examine what's happening south of the border with, the leaders in the White House and the rhetoric and the culture and the value shifts that are happening in organizations all across the United States. So there is a fear of that here in Canada, especially with the United States' recent attack on equity, diversity, inclusivity models. And that sparked some fear in conversations that were happening here north of the border in this country. And people were like, well, what about reconciliation? What about reconciliation? And I just loved a lot of chiefs' responses that were like, we're not going anywhere. If the Canadian government thinks they could get rid of reconciliation, they have another thing coming. And I've seen that from several different, outspoken chiefs who are like, no, we're not going anywhere. I lean firmly. And if you're looking for some hope and inspiration that we stay course and we go strong, which I'm hoping is why part of why you signed and registered for this particular webinar. I live. What helps me sleep at night is the Honorable Justice Murray Sinclair's quote. He was being interviewed by a young Indigenous man years ago, like a decade ago, and he said, reconciliation is inevitable. It's inevitable because of the people, the young Indigenous people, the current Indigenous leaders, and the growing masses of allies we are gathering every single day in this country. That helps me sleep at night. And when I see resistance from people like Dallas Brody, I have more pity than anything, who is such a small, insignificant leader that you see this wave of reconciliation. You see this movement for reconciliation because reconciliation is a movement in this country that it's like a tide, a major tidal shift that our ancestors have known has been coming for a long time. We have prophecies of this. Many of our indigenous cultures across North America have prophecies about a great suffering to our people, colonialism, and then a resurgence, a reclamation, a standing up and taking our rightful place in the world. And I love this quote, and I heard it from a movie that you cannot hold the tide with a broomstick. And that's what I thought about Dallas Brody. It was like, there's this poor, insignificant political leader just, standing with their broomstick trying to hold the tide of change that is happening. What we do need to prepare for is responding to when we see denialism coming up in professional workplaces today, because leaders, quote unquote leaders, who have hateful rhetoric can have this trickle down effect and give people the confidence or the courage to say things that are equally hurtful, equally harmful. So, the hope and the goal of this webinar is to share with you some ethical ways of responding to denialism. And I'm very strategic. If you were chimed into yesterday's presentation, it was all rooted in values driven and ethics driven responses. And I share that because in our Indigenous way of life, we are very heart centered learners, heart centered speakers, heart centered leaders. And so sometimes we have very emotional responses to hurtful, hateful, violent things that come up, which don't always land healthily or constructively in workplaces. And the work that I do and the work that I've learned in the last couple of years teaching anti-racism in every sector in this country is that the bridge between our Indigenous way of life and colonial corporate ways of life is if we find some common ethics and some common values, and then name and label those things to effectively respond to hurtful things when they come about. So that's in a nutshell the story that led me here. So without further ado, I have very short slides today. I have just a couple of slides to get through. And then I want to leave as much time as I possibly can for any questions or comments that come up from the group here today, and hopefully not keep you 1 minute over the 1 o'clock mark Pacific Standard Time. Okay, without further ado, bear with me 1 second here as I share my screen. Where is my share button? Here we go, share. Side by side, desktop, share. And I'm just gonna pop open my Q&A here so I can see questions as they're coming in. There we go. Okay, responding to denialism in professional settings. So I never really want to take it for granted that everybody knows exactly what denialism is. So I'm going to do some basic 101 conversations as well. And that's just not to leave anybody behind. However, for all of my allies on the call here, all of my Indigenous colleagues and relatives on the call here, I think we all know what we're talking about here. And we're here to get to the juicy parts of how do we respond to it. But I will pause with my own trauma-informed hat on and provide a content warning that some of the images, curriculum, and content and conversation in this webinar can be emotionally reactivating for some people. Some of us, not all of us. So I just want to really encourage you to take care of yourself in this virtual space. If you ever need to mute my voice, step away from your device, take a breather, or reach out to a friend, relative, colleague, elder to take care of yourself, please, please do. Doing this work is not just hard work, it is also heart work, because our hearts and our lived experiences of all of our friends and relatives, family members, intergenerational survivors, and survivors of residential schools hits very near and dear to our heart. I'm here for the purposes of not blaming or shaming or reactivating people's traumas, but to share some tools, tips, tricks, and strategies to respond to racism when we see it. So, what is denialism? This is taken from the University of British Columbia and UVic. Denialism is essentially the rejection or misrepresentation of basic facts about residential schools to undermine truth and reconciliation efforts. The twist, downplay, question the scale, or assert that the system wasn't harmful in order to protect colonial narratives and avoid accountability. So I've seen this in two sectors, not two sectors, two predominant areas in my travels over the last 5 years in corporate sectors across the country. I have seen this in education from professors or instructors or public education teachers that will be teaching residential school curriculum and then offer that it wasn't all doom and gloom. It was, there's a lot of great, wonderful things, and it wasn't as bad as the media or Indigenous communities make it out to be. And then, of course, at a very leadership level in corporate organizations, executive leaders, board members, or politically elected leaders like Dallas Brody have been known to be very strong deniers or questioning or rejecting the harms of this horrible, atrocious event in our past against countless generations of our own flesh and blood, our own family members, not just here in colonial Canada, but of course south of the border in the United States as well, through their Indian boarding school process. Denialism in the workplace looks like, when sometimes they come across as quite subtle, under your breath narratives. Like that was a long time ago. We treat everybody the same in this organization. We treat everybody the same in Vancouver. Oh, Vancouver Island's a very diverse, island. There's no such thing as racism here. I've never seen that here. That's a big one. Or people that outright deny that systemic racism exists in this country. What I will say is that denialism is not ignorance, it is resistance. Denialism is not needing more time to learn, and it is not asking respectful questions. So, if you have questions about those, feel free to put them in the Q&A, because these questions come up in our LPC education training sessions all across the country every single day, and our team has ways of responding to them. But I really want to be mindful of that there's no real overlap between some people that are inherently on a learning journey and people that are just spreading hurtful, violent, harmful ways of holding space for these conversations. Why denialism persists today? Why do we find it in the era of truth and reconciliation? Why in the year 2025, in such a free, democratic, progressive country, do we find that denialism persists today? If you've ever sat in one of our LPC training sessions, particularly Introduction to Indigenous Cultural Safety, we talk a lot about colonial socialization. Colonial socialization is the relentless track record that colonial countries across the planet, where those colonial countries adopt a relentless track record for socializing their new citizenry into an anti-Indigenous narrative. And the examples of anti-Indigenous socialization look like the news and the media that have portrayed us as angry Indians, people that you have to watch out for, the portrayal of Indigenous peoples, savages in early Western and animated films like Disney with Pocahontas, Peter Pan, sports mascots that you see affiliated with sports teams, these very racist portrayal of Indigenous peoples. Or if you examine our Canadian history curriculum, there was a Canadian history textbook called Breastplate and Buckskin that portrayed Indigenous peoples as savage, dangerous, heathen people. And that was taught right up until the 1950s, 1960s. That's socialization to a T. And for many political and older, in my perspective, political and older generations in this country, that is the source of what they know about Indigenous peoples, is these very racist, derogatory, hurtful aspects of being socialized into developing a bias against Indigenous peoples. So we call that colonial socialization. And if you have not sat in one of our sessions, check out our website, lenpierreconsulting.com. Look for our Learning Hub and scroll down to the Presentations tab. Open up Introduction to Indigenous Cultural Safety, our slide deck that is archived there, and look up the colonial socialization. And that's going to be the landscape for why we have such widespread systemic harms against Indigenous peoples today. We also do have professional conditioning. I see this in education, healthcare, social services, government, you name it. There is a way when we have new incoming staff that we socialize them and condition them into certain ideologies that we think belong with the profession or the institution. This is a big one. I see a lot of people that have a tremendous amount of fear. If you're a Star Wars fan like I am, hate comes from fear. Hate comes from fear. And this is what I feel to be one of the biggest barriers to reconciliation today is the rhetoric south of the border, with all this fear mongering about people of color, about immigrants to the country. It's generating this us and them narrative. And this us and them narrative really is stoking the flames of fear that stoke the flames of hate and then that stoke the flames of violence between fellow human beings in a country. When leaders in an organization or political leaders for a province, town, city, or country are perpetuating fear among their citizenry, this is a very, very dangerous political leader. And often that fear mongering will stoke the flames of violence against its own citizenry. It's where war comes from. No war has ever been started without some fear mongering that comes along with it. At an interpersonal level, most of the time, I see a fear of liability, a fear of reputation of harm, or getting it wrong. Most of the time when I encounter defensiveness is a human psychological tactic, and it's usually when somebody's identity feels at threat. So we train, oh my gosh, I don't know, thousands and thousands of professionals every single year at LPC. And so you can imagine the conversations that we lead and the conversations we facilitate that with a very diverse group of professionals coming from different cultural backgrounds, ethical backgrounds, religious backgrounds, and people born on every corner of the planet, that some resistance comes up in our sessions against our own facilitators, youth advisors, elder advisors. And every time when we peel back the layers of debriefing a very intense conversation with a member of our audience, it always comes from that person who feels like their identity was under attack. So, as human beings, it's a very strong psychological defense mechanism that if somebody's attacking our identity, we will fight to the death to protect what we think we know. And that's again coming from socialization. If your entire life in your family there was racist rhetoric against Indigenous peoples, and you learned about Indigenous peoples through things like Pocahontas, Peter Pan, what you've seen in the news and the media, the portrayal of Indigenous peoples in sports mascots, Halloween costumes, the racist stereotypes you hear about Indigenous peoples, that shapes a very solid framework about Indigenous peoples in your identity, how you view and see the world. And then if somebody comes in and explains the truth to you with education, that's a natural attack on your identity if you don't have your own healing in place to begin with. And the result is resistance. The result is responding to threat, with defensiveness or outright violence. And so this is what we see in a lot of the time. I have a firm faith in humanity. I really do. I believe that we don't roll out of bed as human beings to go and pick a fight or hurt people. The vast majority of us, the vast majority of us do not. There are some people because of other psychological aspects and trauma aspects that do. But in this country and in this day and age, I do have a firm faith in humanity that when we do know better, we do. When we know better, we do better. And so that's why we try to lean in with as much transformative education as we possibly can. Denialism does protect comfort and it does not protect people. I often see denialism as a mechanism to stay in the zone of comfort, to stay where I don't have to hear these awful truths. I don't have to think of my country, my religious institute, my previous generations, my ancestors. I don't have to sit with that comfort if I just simply deny its existence, which will come at the cost of people's safety and people's rights at the end of the day. At the end of the day, and I know that, so many of you represent, local universities, colleges, health authorities, nonprofit organizations, for-profit organizations, private corporations. It's important to know that denialism is a workplace safety issue. It's a workplace safety issue. You don't need to be an expert in racism to talk about racism because racism is a workplace safety issue. And whose job is it to be safe in the workplace? All of ours. It's all of our jobs to be safe in the workplace. So, should you encounter denialism in the workplace, we need to pick up on these generational colonial patterns that have been around, for far, far, far too long. Um, the harms that result place unnecessary emotional and relational labor on your own Indigenous staff and colleagues, whether they're on the payroll, whether they're contracted, whether they're returning guests and visitors like performers, drummers, singers, elders, cultural advisors, or the community partners you work with that are Indigenous nonprofits, Indigenous governments. It has this ripple effect of harm. It will erode the trust with Indigenous communities. It stalls reconciliation commitments and it increases moral injury for staff trying to do the right thing. Okay, now here's the meat and potatoes of our webinar. How to respond to denialism. And I have other tips and tools for responding to racism in general. But when it comes to denialism, I've picked a couple of different tools, three different tools to share with you. The other tools that I share for responding to Indigenous racism are located in other areas. And if you're interested, just let me know in the Q&A function. But when it comes to denialism, I wanted to create some more context-specific tools because it is in the realm of politics. We do see it in the news and in the media and academia as well. So the first tool I will share with you, and this is the tool we live by at LPC, my entire team and we respond with truth and calm. Not debate. Not debate. Debate is very much a colonial practice. It's a colonial tool. In debate, you're constantly not listening to the other person. You're listening to respond to them, to pick a weakness in their what they are saying, and then prove them wrong. This is not about proving people wrong. However, I encourage folks to stay ethical in your responses, your professional responses to denialism should you encounter it in the workforce. So the ethical anchor that I want you to hold true to here, is truth telling is a responsibility, not a contest. Truth is one of the 7 sacred laws across Turtle Island. And competitive nature is also a value of colonialism as well. Whereas Indigenous ways of being and doing and knowing come from this place of cooperation and collaboration. So I live by Dr. Vicki Reynolds' words that we can't fight oppression with oppression. And this kind of famous guy, Dr. Albert Einstein, who said something along the lines of, you can't solve problems by using the same thinking that we used when we created those problems to begin with. I also lean heavily on Audre Lorde's quote of, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So we can't use colonial tools to address colonial problems. So if we want to come at this conversation with debate, contest, competition, that's just going to stoke the flames of fire and tension and hate and the growing divide we see in this country, and even more so south of the border as well. So, an example of responding with truth and calm and not debate would look like, I understand that's what you've heard, but the National Commission for Truth and Reconciliation has thousands of survivor records showing otherwise. It's important we base our understanding on their truth. That's going to be easier said than done, I know, but it's practice, not perfection. And our goal here is not to change anybody. Our goal is not to change people's mind or change people's behaviors, because we can't control that. We can't control that. What we can control is what we stand for, and that is our own ethics and the way we show up to do our work. As I mentioned yesterday, if you need to escalate it, then you need to escalate it. If you feel like harm is continually being perpetuated and denialism is a workplace safety issue, you have other mechanisms. Your direct supervisor, your HR, your anti-racism cultural safety policies, those are in place for a reason, and we need to use those. But in that moment, do not debate, respond with your ethical anchor. Truth telling is our responsibility. Number two, this is again, oh my gosh, harder, easier said than done. Lead with empathy and curiosity before correction. So the ethical anchor here is listening to understand, again, not to win. So an example of that would be, that's an interesting perspective. Can I ask where you first learned that? So when you lean into the conversation, and I do this, I live by this, I practice this, I don't just teach this, I practice it too. When folks present themselves questioning or denying in my audience, in my participant group, in my client group, in my client services, I will lean in. Your gut reaction is to go, oh, I'm pissed, I'm angry, I have some things I gotta say to you right now. Then my training kicks in. My training kicks in because I want to stay ethical and true to myself. And I also want to stay true to how much of myself I give to people. If I respond with emotion and anger and disgust and resentment, I'm like, I don't feel like these people are worthy of those very firm feelings. So I hold up my own ethical, emotional boundary for being like, I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised in the work that I do. And so I just hold that on to that. I don't own it. I just say, no, I have an emotional reaction. That's okay. I can deal with that. But I know where the source streams, the source revenues of this kind of rhetoric and understanding and perspectives come from. So giving this person a little ounce of empathy to be like, can you please tell me more? Where did you get that? And some people I've learned in my travels too, that when you lean in more and more and more, that a person really starts to see that they're not going to get into resistance with you. They're not picking a fight with you, which they could have been their motivator to begin with to prove themselves. That now that you've kind of cornered them into a place that they have come up to are their own aha moment of being like, this is really awkward. This is really, because they've never had that time or opportunity to do so with somebody like yourself who was leading and championing that conversation. Again, easier said than done. Emotional regulation, doing this kind of work, hard work. I'm not saying it's easy work, but I'm saying it is work that we can do. And this is the last one I have, and this is the end of the slides. Number three, naming harm and setting boundaries when needed. So the ethical anchor here is protecting the dignity of survivors and communities. I'm not here to win. I'm not here to fight. I have a job I have to do. I have a job I want to keep. My job is to protect the dignity of survivors and the communities and the families that I come from, the families and communities that I belong to. And if you're an ally, it's the people that you believe should be protected and treated with respect and dignity. Because I know many of us, for all of us who are Indigenous on this call, this is very near and dear to our home. This is ourselves. This is our moms and dads, our aunties and uncles, our grandparents, our great grandparents, and great 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 grandparents, and great 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 grandparents. And for our allies who are on the call here, it's because it's human rights. It's because it is the just thing to do. And you stand in solidarity for Indigenous rights. Indigenous rights are not special rights. Indigenous rights are human rights. And denialism is a little sliver that is impacting that because it's a resistance to Indigenous rights at the end of the day. So the ethical anchor here is protecting dignity of survivors and communities. An example of responding with this tool is, I can't let that go unaddressed. I cannot let that go unaddressed. That kind of statement dismisses real harm experienced by survivors. I invite you to learn more about Indigenous voices instead. And then you know what? End it. Boundary. And then you're on your way. Again, your job is not to conform people because conformity to me sounds an awful lot like assimilation, which is colonialism. But our job is to respond. As human beings in the work that we do, we can do a lot of things. We can show up late, we can stay later, we can, really do incredible things in the work that we do because our hearts are in it. But if there's one thing that we cannot do as human beings, and that's being unethical with ourselves, and let those kind of slide by. So when you respond, you know, our ethics can remain intact. The integrity of our ethics can stand. And then again, if you find that your response is falling upon dead ears and harm in the workplace is being perpetuated even more, there's other colonial corporate tools that we have at our disposal where you can escalate it. Okay, my dear friends and colleagues, as promised, the last 20 minutes here is just for more of an open Q&A. So at this time, if you have questions, comments, feel free to type that in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you're somebody like me that talks way faster than I type, you're welcome to raise your hand and it'll put you into the queue as well. And I can invite you to unmute yourself. If you'd like to bring in your question, your comment, and then we'll share that with all of our friends and colleagues in the space here. So I'm going to turn my attention to the chat box, but I see that Rachel has her hand up. So Rachel, just allow me 1 second here. I'm going to invite you to unmute yourself.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Len. It's not denialism specifically that I have the question about, but it's, I think, closely connected. So I've had a question from a colleague recently, and it's very much in light of the Cowichan Lands decision and their, sort of interpretation of that as potentially infringing private ownership rights. I don't necessarily, subscribe to that view, but that's where they're coming from. And they are basically refusing to do land acknowledgements because they feel like it's in sort of contradiction, or it's a sort of a clash with us supporting people. I work for a financial institution.
Mm,
And so, yeah, just this sort of tension that they seem to be feeling. It's not denialism, but it is pushing back
okay.
against reconciliation.
Yeah, absolutely. Haichka, thank you so much, Rachel. Yeah, it's not so much denialism. I agree. I'm just going to take you out of the queue. That is what I would call is colonial resistance. And this example that you've shared is not too uncommon, sadly. And because of the news and the media, again, there is a lot of fear mongering around the Cowichan case. And now, again, backed by a lot of political leaders who are perpetuating this rhetoric of fear mongering among its citizenry. And then again, trickles down into our corporate spaces, our corporate finance, law, education, social services, you name it. It has this trickle down effect. When you are met with resistance, again, I would use these three tools. Probably the third tool of responding with truth and then holding your boundaries. Because it sounds like this person's not going to change. And they were waiting for the moment of having an out. And then they seen their out and then they took it. Because all of this fear mongering around, fee simple property and private landowners in municipalities all across this province are not going to lose the properties, not going to lose the keys to their house, not going to lose the deeds to their property. It's misinformation, a mountain of misinformation, and it's coming from colonial socialization at the end of the day. How I would respond to that is with your truth telling and then your boundaries. Our job is not to change people's mind because, and I share that with you to stay true to your ethics and to not bear anybody else's emotional labor. Because if you engage, there's there's a fork in the road for me every time I met with resistance, and I trust my gut more than anything. So the first little path on the fork in the road is if I sense this person will engage with me, lean in with a healthy curiosity and ask healthy, ethical questions. I'm like, okay, I can work with engagement. Why? I'm a consultant, I'm a teacher by trade, and I'm in it for the learning and the teaching. So if I sense people will engage with me, I have a lot of time for that. In fact, it's my job as a consultant and as an educator. The second fork in the road is when I sense I will be met with resistance. And again, it's not so much of this brain I use, it's like this brain and my gut. When you're doing this work, Dr. Gabor Mate says that we have three brains. We have this one, and we have our gut. They all have their different nervous system. And when you're doing this good work of reconciliation, you need all three brains acting in unison and in alignment when you're responding, because your own safety is needed as well to stay in the zone of allyship and solidarity with Indigenous peoples. So, how would I respond to colonial resistance in that case with saying we're not going to do land acknowledgements, territory acknowledgements, because it's going to confuse people? It's not confusing anybody. It sounds like you're confused. And you're missing a very large opportunity here for reconciliation that will not confuse people, that is the right thing to do, the most courteous thing to do. And I give a lot of attention and praise to people who move around their fear and not let it be a deterrent. Or I give a lot of praise to allies who role model through their own beingness in that organization, who will do a territory acknowledgement in their own organization or their own team and say, when they're doing the territory acknowledgement, if that person is in your audience and they're like, I know there's a lot of fear mongering that's going around and confusion around, the Cowichan case and whether or not territory acknowledgements should be done anymore. But I have no fear and no worries or concerns as an aspiring ally because I am here in solidarity with Indigenous peoples in this country because reconciliation is the right thing to do. And I will not stand for fear mongering, that we see in the news and the media. So here's my territory acknowledgement. That would be like a very cool display of allyship in a moment, and really role modeling, walking the walk and talking the talk of good, really, really good allyship. So I hope that was helpful, Heichka. Thank you so much, Rachel. Okay, let's see. I'm going to turn my attention to the chat box here, the Q&A box, sorry. Um, can you expand on it not being time to learn? Yes. So time is a thing. I'm just going to be very transparent with you. Depending on your sector, depending on your professional domain, having access to these types of learning opportunities is quite a privilege. I know because I work with all of those professional sectors. And there is a hierarchy of which professional domains get the highest opportunities to do their learning. Chief among them, healthcare. There's a very big call to action because there's hundreds of thousands of healthcare workers across this province. There's a lot of protected time. Now that depends on the department too, because emergency staff don't always have the time. Paramedics don't always have the time. But corporate professionals, healthcare, I see a lot of our time and attention going towards educating people in healthcare. Education, also very, very privileged position. Teachers, principals, EAs, youth care workers, anybody who works in education get really good, safe, healthy, protected time. I mean, it's never enough time, but there are a lot of sectors that they're not even talking about reconciliation. The trades, to begin with, If you have people in the trades, they're not talking about equity, they're not talking about diversity. I mean, they are to a degree, but it's not compared to other government run organizations. So when time is a factor, it is, because we need time to learn. And it is a privilege to be in these spaces of listening and learning. So the biggest areas where I'm seeing not a lot of time is being shared to learn is the private corporate sector, people with privately owned companies and businesses that think this is not important. And if you think it's not important as an organization when you are a member of a society and a community, because most businesses, private corporations have a give back, social responsibility commitment, reconciliation might not be thought of. And another one would be the trades, construction, people who work in camps in mining or lumber or oil. There's not a lot of conversations happening there for education and training for cultural safety and reconciliation. And if you just think back to your own time in this country, did you get time to learn about Indigenous people, history, and culture in university, in college, in high school, in elementary school? If you did, you were very lucky, but the vast majority of the population has not. Now, I say it's a privilege because it's a corporate place that usually it's an institutional place that gives us the most time for learning about these things. And then, of course, there's a counter argument there too, where it's like, no, you're a Canadian citizen, so you should learn about these. Well, nothing in Canadian society has ever said you as a Canadian citizen should learn about this. If you're a newcomer to the country, meaning that you immigrated to Canada because you were born in another place, and if you went through the immigration services on how to become a citizen here, there's no time or opportunity or requirement to learn about the history of this country because Canada will say one thing, but then, the proven track record of scaffolding it systematically to have a robust education and training is not happening. So that's what I mean saying when people have not had the time. Because time is a luxury, and if you have an organization that gives you the time to do it, it's actually a thing of privilege, but we'll take it. That's what I mean when people, may not have the time to learn. But again, there's the moral, social responsibility of being like, no, we should be learning, but Canada's not really creating an ecosystem that is rewarding of that time when you see what's on the news and the media today. Um, I facilitate a peer-led Indigenous cultural safety and anti-racism working group for fellow social workers. Oh, wonderful. I recently experienced one of my peers who attends my gatherings monthly, sharing some of the freedom of speech rhetoric related to Dallas Brody's attempt to be at UVic. My relatives were there singing and drumming in support of residential school survivors. How do I navigate this dynamic in my ICS gatherings moving forward? Well, I would very much strongly, no, not strongly, because if you're a facilitator, safety is in your control. And I have some lived experience in this regard. If I were you, if I were walking in your physical shoes when one of your participants is counter arguing the freedom of speech rhetoric for validating Dallas Brody Douglas, freedom of speech is a wonderful thing. I'm not going to say it's a bad thing, but what Dallas Brody is doing is not freedom of speech. It is rooted in hate. And then we have lots of research and evidence and scholarly papers on the difference of freedom of speech and hate speech. And that's just like a decades old long thing that people of color, activists in equity, diversity, inclusivity, and reconciliation have been uncovering. And so freedom of speech and hate speech are not the same things because counter to that, leaders at the Assembly of First Nations are asking for denialism to be, listed under hate speech in this country, to deny the evidence, the overwhelming evidence that residential schools was a hurtful, hateful policy where countless children have lost their lives. To diminish that is not truth telling. It's hate speech. It's rooted in hatred. And many of her fellow political leaders have, claimed her as such. many of her political peers have listed her as a spreader of hate speech and a spreader of hate and racism. So I would hold space for the conversation of, what is the difference between hate speech and freedom of speech? Because they are not the same things. And then find those language pieces to be able to navigate that when you're in a group setting. Hi, Chika. From Tracy, yes. Our other tools on racism are there's three of them. So I've shared with you these ones for responding to denialism. The other three tools that we have in our anti-racism course that we teach at LPC, the first one is calling it out. You call out somebody. So if you're in public and you see somebody, saying that denying residential schools or anything racist against Indigenous peoples, calling it out in public. So calling it out is just to shut it down right away to create immediate safety for the people involved. So to the earlier example of, challenging Dallas Brody, who wanted to create this massive, public dialogue, that was called out. That was like shut down. That's calling out. I would not use calling out with people you work with in the workplace. Because if you, in the team meeting or the staff meeting, go to your colleague and say, hey, did you know you're a racist? That's not going to end well for you or your colleague. So therein we have calling in. Calling in racism is exactly that. You go off and you have another conversation, a side conversation, and you let your colleague know what you witnessed in terms of their language or behavior and how you interpreted that to be discriminatory in nature based on your learning journey so far. When you make it about their language and behavior, it's not an attack on their identity. It's now a workplace safety issue. It's now about a conversation about professionalism. And that can be documented should you need to escalate it. But that's calling in. The third tool that we often share is what we call a call up culture. Calling up is calling your team up to be creating and cultivating a culture of feedback and a culture of critique. With your teams. So that's instilling a good feedback culture so that if somebody on my team wants to, give me the feedback that I was being sexist, ableist, racist, I have been trained that in this team, we are open to feedback. So when somebody says, hey, Len, I have some feedback for you, I'm going to open up the head space and the heart space to be able to receive that feedback. Because when I know better, I do better. So that's a call up culture. So calling out, calling in, and calling up. If you're interested in more depth and breadth to those other three tools, check out our YouTube channel and look for Len's favorite anti-racism tools. And I explain calling out, calling in much more broader detail. Good questions. Oh my gosh. Okay, from Tegan, can you share your tips on staying regulated? Yes. So, and this is from Monica too. How do you keep so calm and grounded? What tools or strategies do you suggest to help anchor emotions and reactions? This is a really, really good conversation. Okay, so my tool is that I mentioned it earlier on in the webinar where I am very mindful of, like when I was younger, I'm just being very transparent with you. When I was younger, I was a very angry, indigenous young man. That was my teenage years. And then I became a dad and my focus on reality shifted, which, is part of being a parent. But when I was younger, I was very, very emotional, very, very unregulated. I mean, I think physically. But I've learned from elders and mentors of mine. One of them is Salish Wesley, who was a teacher, mentor of mine when I was coming up through my teacher training at UBC's 9-TEP program. And Salish taught me, the importance of, maintaining your grace, your respect, and your dignity for yourself when you're dealing with challenging people. Because the world is it's a crazy place, the world. And it can actually be quite a cruel place as well. And when you release emotions, you are giving of yourself. And it's only been in doing this work in the last 5 years that I've actually come to terms with my emotions, that I want to be very mindful of who I'm giving so much of myself to. That's why I say if people are meeting me with allyship, solidarity, I know that they're in it to because it's the right thing to do. I have a lot of time for that. I will give them as much time as I possibly can, as much praise and emotion as I possibly can. But when I'm being met with resistance or denialism, I don't want to give that person any more than I actually need to, which is basically the time that I have to be there because it's my job to facilitate. And so I'm not going to give this person a tear or a vibration in anger. I'm like, because that's energy. That's energy. And people always wonder how I have so much energy to do this every single day. I'm like, it's not, I'm not always giving of myself. I'm giving of self myself of to people who are in it to stay engaged, to learn and change. I have a lot of room for that. But when I find that, it fills me up too. So I know I get something out of it. And when I first started this career 27 years ago, I wasn't like that. I was like angry and I was emotional and I was responding and I was dysregulated. And then I would find I was exhausted all the time. I was tired. I was jaded. I was like, how long can I actually do this work? But once I found that actually, no, I found a way to create a spiritual shield of, protecting my aura and my energy for my Indigenous colleagues and other people, who come from a similar cultural background. I also live by maintaining my emotions by this firm knowledge that I don't do this work alone. I don't. When you're met with resistance in that moment, you think it's you and this one other person, or maybe multiple people, and that's very lonely. That's very isolating. But I live by a faith that I do not do this work alone. I have countless, a number beyond reckoning of Indigenous scholars, Indigenous activists, elders. Many of you are on the call here, Indigenous colleagues of mine who are doing the same work, and countless allies who are doing, this work as well. And that fills up my cup and that helps me to sleep at night by knowing, I don't have to change this person, I don't have to conform them. And I really think of myself as belonging to a movement, and this person must feel so alone, so isolated, so insignificant, and so small for the movement that I belong to. Because the movement that I belong to and that all of you belong to by being here today, this reconciliation movement, is generational. We're only here because of our ancestors that came, 10 years ago. Because we celebrated the 10th year, didn't celebrate, we honored the 10-year anniversary for the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action just yesterday. Do you know how many generations and blood, sweat, and tears had to go into just making that happen 10 years ago? Then before that, in the 1990s and the 1980s, like we're here because we are part of a generational movement. And I get to be a part of that movement, and that fills up my cup. So I don't feel alone in that. And when I think about this person, I do have a place in my heart that has a little bit of pity for people that want to be so hurtful and hateful and holding that space with negativity. I'm like, but how insignificant and small this person must feel. But it grounds me in my confidence to be able to hold my space, that I am not making it all about me. That's harder, to make it not all about you, because then you're becoming self-centered if you're making it all about you. And it's hard. I blow it all the time. I'm like, I'm offended. I'm hurt that you're talking about my grandma and my aunties that went to residential school here. But then my training kicks in, and then I become back to being work-centered. And work-centered is knowing that I'm not alone in this work, that I have many allies and colleagues who are doing this work, and that this work is generational and it's only growing in masses every single day. That's how I maintain my emotional regulation. Okay. I may not have heard properly, but not sure competitiveness is a colonial trait, but a human trait. It's hard for me to see our ancestors fulsomely competing with each other in many ways, like hunting, paddling. But if you mean when addressing denialism, okay, fair enough. Well, thank you for sharing that. As of all of these things, one of the hardest things to shake in these conversations is black and white thinking. What I'm sharing with you is not black and white thinking. What I'm sharing with you is that there are patterns in colonial cultures and there are patterns in indigenous cultures. The pattern of that I see in indigenous cultures is a value towards collaboration and cooperation. the pattern that I see in more prominent in colonial cultures is competitiveness and uh, competition. And so, of course, there's a lot that these two have in common. Of course, they're interchangeable. Of course, our ancestors were competitive as well. Of course, there was collaboration among colonial settler societies as well. But the essence of what I was saying was the patterns that dominate worldviews is the thing that I'm most interested in as well. Okay, one more question and then I'm going to release us all. Um, As an ally, I find it more often to respond to people in my life who I know well. I feel like sharing the learning I have been able to access will help some who are not hearing anything other than denialism is what is so easy to find in media. What is the best way to share my learning with the wider way at work? Start a conversation. One of the tools that cannot be underestimated is our ability to carry a conversation. Start with your immediate inner circle of your friends at work. Share with them this recorded webinar. Share with them, some of the resources you can find on our website. Then move outward. And if you're in a space of providing an update in your staff meeting or team meeting, don't be afraid to advocate for watching this webinar. Don't be afraid to advocate or speak up or share some of your tools, tips, or tricks or strategies. Don't be afraid to, strike a book club or a decolonization committee or a reconciliation committee if that's suited to your context. But you don't need to be Indigenous to talk about Indigenous things. That's where we find the greatest allies is, when reconciliation is spoken by everybody because it's a social responsibility, not an Indigenous responsibility. Reconciliation is a movement, and we don't have to be part of a movement. We get to be a part of it. So I invite you to use your voice and speak up and advocate for bringing these learning spaces into your professional workspace. Okay, my dear friends and colleagues, it's 1:03 on the dot. I will release you all and just say Heights Epicasiam. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here. I will probably see many of you all again on Thursday with our next webinar, which is how to hold the space with grace and dignity when you have contrasting teachings from elders or recommendations from Indigenous leaders or consultants. How do we hold that tension in our professional workspaces when you have opposing practices or teachings coming into the place? If you're going to be there on Thursday, wonderful. I will see you there on Thursday. And of course, if anybody isn't yet, feel free to give me a follow on social media. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter. And have a great day, everybody. Bye bye.